the oppressors, the victims and the victimizers, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. That's what you've got in the world, and these are groups that are interlocked in antagonistic environment almost to eternity. If there is any inequality, 51%, 49%, then somehow that must entail injustice. And you've got to rectify the injustice with those social groups, and that's what you are, is a group in this worldview, identity politics. Instead of persuading, you oftentimes end up coercing the majority group, the oppressor group, to give it up to the oppressed group. And so in socialism, we talk about a redistribution of wealth, but this is race, class, sex, and gender. So you have the identity politics, you have the notion of social justice, which by critical theory standards just is liberation. That's what they mean by liberation, liberating the socio-economic oppressed in all of these classes, right? And even the term political correctness has some origins in the Red Army. Sir, is this correct? Does it matter? It's politically correct. There is political truth and there is truth. There is social justice and there is justice. From a Christian standpoint, the Bible uses terms like justice and compassion. Social justice is a foreign concept, foreign term, but I would argue in most cases, as it's broadly used, especially in the university, it's got a foreign meaning to the biblical text, and oftentimes an antagonistic one as well. Again, not always, but it's a fish. It's really hard to define. I've just characterized it for you. I think it's very important that we learn how to disagree agreeably. Voltaire said that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Contrast that then with something Stalin said, that ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons, so why should we let them have ideas? That's what this new left, not the old left, but this new left, this neo-Marxist identity politics, liberatory consciousness, social justice in the broader sense, especially as it's used in the humanities and social sciences in the universities, that's what this is about. And it ends up stifling not only free speech, but cognitive thought itself, cognitive liberty rather. It claims to be about freedom, freeing the oppressed, but it does so at the expense of real justice, I would say, and at the expense of cognitive liberty. A bit of the history of the university, at least in the US. You begin in 1636, shortly after they got off the Mayflower, and they started this university called Harvard, the Puritans. And the motto was Veritas, in Latin, truth, capital T truth. They didn't believe in 7.5 billion little truths. There was one truth. All truth is God's truth. And the university was about that. For almost 300 years, the motto got changed to truth for Christ and the church. Yale, same thing, Princeton, Columbia, on down the line up until 1840 even, 200 years later, 80% of college presidents were actually members of the clergy as well. By 1890, chapel and church attendance were still required. That was just over a century ago. There was a changing of the guard. I'm not going to go into details of it, about the larger idea underlining most of the disciplines, and it was a scientific naturalism that inspired a change in what was the established Protestant universities to Protestant non-belief. Most all the universities for the first 200, 250 years were Protestant, and they were Christ-centered. Scientific naturalism ended up in the universities reducing Christianity to morality. You get things called the social gospel. We don't need to go into further detail. Now what we're seeing, as I would see it, is phase two, but instead of coming in through the hard sciences, it's coming in through the humanities. And I think what happened a century ago laid the groundwork, created in the labs, this Frankenstein that's now emerged, not only in the humanities, but now is eclipsing even the hard sciences, which has got even neo-atheists concerned, because this new left, this neo-Marxism approach, doesn't cohere with the even debate earlier on between, say, naturalists and theists. Still, that new guard that took over believed that truth is real, it's knowable, it's objective, maybe it's only scientific for them, but nonetheless, we can debate these things. This new view thinks that truth is that which my peers will let me get away with, to quote Richard Rorty. It is that knowledge is a social construction of reality. Even your identity politics, identity everything, trans species, transgender, trans whatever, ageism, trans racism, all of it. Identity, along with everything else we would consider knowledge. Knowledge is but a social construction of reality. That's what this whole thing is somewhat of a fish. So, looking at the university situation now, we have around the 1930s, that was all done. It was a new guard in the university. What was happening in Europe at the time, Marxism had ended badly, it was failed in its predictions, and so a new group, neo-Marxists, came together in Frankfurt, Germany, okay? In Frankfurt, Germany, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory began, and neo-Marxism, or cultural Marxism, scratched their heads and thought, okay, how are we gonna do this? We've gotta have a more slow, gradual, methodical approach, one that, as Antonio Gramsci in the Italian sector of this neo-Marxism said, is that we've got to go after the non-coercive elements of society, not revolution, through religion, through education, politics, and things like that. And it'll take a process. The critical theorists in Frankfurt, don't need to get into the names, you've got a lot of details back there in a booklet, Critical Theory of the Social Justice Movement. They talked about the dividing of the line between sex, race, class, and gender. A lot of people, when they think about Marxism, they think communism, an economic system, economic criticism. I had a paper published in International Philosophical Quarterly talking about this a couple of years ago, and that was only tertiary for Marx. Secondary was political criticism. Primary for Marx was religious criticism. Religion is the opium of the masses, right? For the rich people, they could get through a hard life with opium. But for the poor people, they needed the drug of religion. But if you give everyone equal stuff across the board, they'll just throw off religion. It's the reason why people are religious, they have religious beliefs, is because of socio-economic oppression. So the ultimate goal, remember, with this movement is liberation through socio-economic means, okay? So, in 1933, the National Socialist Party came into power. It was a bad place to be in Frankfurt, in Germany, if you are a Jew and you're a globalist socialist, right? An Antifa, an anti-fascist. They were both socialists. One was a National Socialist, they liked blue eyes too. The other was a globalist socialist. Stalin and Hitler didn't like each other very well. Most of the founders of this movement were Jewish. Bad place to be, get out of there, where do you go? You go spot yourself at Columbia University, begin the slow methodical process, going through the Ivy Leagues, publish some very, very influential books in the social sciences and humanities that just got to their apex of influence right in time for the revolution of the 1960s, the student protests, the sexual revolutions, and so forth. And given some leavening of that over time, that many people in that movement entered into academia, into education, into the social sciences, and at the time, you had a probably left to right ratio in faculty in America of about 2.3 to 1, which is, significant, but it's still fair. You can still get rid of confirmation bias, right? You can still hear various sides, and critical thinking, not critical theory, can take place. As soon as the mid-1990s started and the replacement of new scholars started jumping into the academy, especially with this influence, suddenly they were skyrocketing in the numbers to the point where now it is 12 to 1 for ages 65 and older getting ready to retire. And for those younger scholars, 40 and under, it is 23 to 1. And in the New England area, most of those universities, it's 28 to 1. And if you think about religious studies, it's 70 to 1. Talk about echo chamber. Talk about bad for education. Once you end up getting a politically homogenous group, it starts to take on a movement of its own, legs of its own, and it starts to establish political orthodoxy, not heterodoxy, not viewpoint diversity, but a politically correct view. And if you touch certain sacred cows, That's gonna cost you. That's what we're seeing happening in the university today. There is not viewpoint diversity. Alan Bloomberg, running for the president, was at Harvard doing a commencement address, and he said that Harvard, like all other Ivy League schools, is a good university, but it's not a great university. How would you like to be sitting there graduating going, who brought this guy in? And you can go read this, the Bloomberg report, just Google it today. He said, to be a great university, you'd have to go beyond the good university, which has diversity of sex and race and gender and class. To be a great university, you also have to have viewpoint diversity. And he said, when 96% of all Ivy League faculty gave campaign contributions to Barack Obama, something tells me that people are not getting a fair education. That coming from Alan Bloomberg. A lot of people on the left, like Jonathan Haidt, are noticing this. Steven Pinker is noticing this. It's what's drawing Dr. Bogosian and myself together too. This is bad for education. It's bad for critical thinking skills. Students aren't exposed to a variety of things, and it creates a political orthodoxy and a political bat to knock out and silence the opposition. And that's why you're seeing what's happening in culture happen. What goes on in the university does not stay in the university. Thank you.